my name is Woody Giles. I'm with TSW. We're the firm that has been hired by the city of Dunwoody to do the master plan and zoning update process. This is our second meeting, and the point of the open house today is just to get public input on what is definitely a draft. So we're asking for everyone's feedback. The background here is the 2011 Dunwoody Village Master Plan. I know a number of people in the room were part of those public meetings, and that plan was officially adopted by City Council. Really, everyone agreed as a part of that the long-term vision for the village was to be a more mixed-use, walkable place, really the heart of Dunwoody and sort of the downtown. So we're not here to change that vision. We know everyone agrees, but we're here to talk about the zoning changes that are necessary to make that happen. Our first meeting was in the same room on June 29th. We had about 200 people here. We reviewed the previous plan, and we had some initial ideas put out there about zoning and transportation that we got feedback on and have changed things today based on the feedback we got. And then we also had a walking tour, which was really fun to kind of get out in the village and see how walkable it is or how not walkable it is, and also specific types of development and what's working and not working. So we use some of those photos and measurements and observations to actually tweak the zoning code that you see today. So I'll start just briefly with some transportation items, and then most of what we're going to talk about is zoning. The main update that we're talking about to the previous master plan is some updates to the proposed design for Chambly-Dunwoody Road and Mount Vernon Road. The previous master plan talked about wide sidewalks, landscaping, and trees. That's all still in there. But our goal is to really try and make sure that these streets are safe and safe places to walk. So we're showing fewer lanes and narrow lanes with the idea that it would help slow down the traffic, make it easier to cross the street, make it safer to walk and bike. If you want to see those plans in more detail, they're on the board in the back of the room. The other challenge we're dealing with from a transportation framework is just the traffic and the limited roads that you have today. If you look at this diagram at the right, that's all the streets that you have today. So there's basically two streets feeding in that become one street, Chambly-Dunwoody, which splits, I guess just off of our map, sort of splits again, but everyone, when you come to the village, is concentrated on that one north-south street. And if you're going east-west, everyone is concentrated onto Mount Vernon. So we've heard a lot of complaints about traffic, but really the issue there is just that everyone is concentrated on that. So our proposal in the long term is to have a zoning requirement that requires developers to build new streets as they redevelop their property. And this will be a gradual, incremental approach, but over time we'll build out a street grid that looks something like this, which means that there's more ways to get to your destination. You won't be stuck just on one of those two roads, but there's a network of streets. There's alternate ways to get there. That also means that it's easier to walk. There's a shorter walking distance to your destination. I was talking with someone earlier who lives nearby here and walks to the village but has to go all the way out of his neighborhood and around and back in. So having more streets will really help with those connections. We're also proposing two future roundabouts, one at the intersection of Chambly-Dunwoody and Mount Vernon, and one at the intersection of Chambly-Dunwoody and Dunwoody Village Parkway. The goal there, again, is to slow traffic. We still want to make sure traffic gets through. We understand there's a lot of commuters.
Just listen up here. If you can't hear, thank you.
We understand there's a lot of commuters that come through, and we still want to make sure that the traffic can move. But having those roundabouts will allow the capacity, but really keep everyone slow and moving so that it's, again, a lot safer for pedestrians. The area that we're looking at today is currently Dunwoody Village Overlay Zoning District. We're proposing that go away and be replaced with new zoning. That's what you see on the map here and the map in the room, and I think everyone got a handout as you came in. We're proposing 4 districts within the new Dunwoody Village zoning. You can see those 3 colors, and each of those has different uses and regulations that I'll talk through a little bit. But more than a zoning map, this is also what's called a regulating map, and that means that it shows those proposed streets that developers would have to build out the street network. It shows where storefronts would be required to be built and walking trails and a few other things that I'll get into later. So the goal of zoning is really to take the vision of the future of the village and put that into rules that developers have to follow, create a real sense of place, a real sort of heart for Dunwoody, make the development decisions predictable, fair, and cost-effective. The zoning today, having the overlay and the base zoning together, is not always super clear, so we're just trying to make that really straightforward, both for citizens who are trying to understand the zoning and developers who might be coming in. And also provide the flexibility. So you'll see we do have some regulations. There are things we felt important that we needed to require, that we heard from you, but there's other places where there's a lot of flexibility that they get to decide how to implement that as they're redeveloping. To streetscapes, one thing that we want to require with redevelopment is that developers put in new sidewalks. One great way to do that is to require the developers to do it so that over time, as different things redevelop, you get your nice sidewalks, that network of sidewalks without the city having to do it. So the code requires sidewalks to be between 8 and 12 feet wide, so very generous sidewalks. Developers also would have to put in street lights, benches, and street furniture to make it a nice place to walk. They would have to put the utilities underground, which sometimes can be complicated or prohibitively expensive, so that may be something that the city would partner with them on. And there is adjustments that can be made to the streetscape. So if there's a tree they're trying to save or some other unusual circumstance, then the city can vary these requirements where it makes sense. One new thing in the proposed zoning is 4 types of buildings, and each of those types of buildings, you can see on the board there near the door, has different regulations in terms of how they're designed, how much glass they have to have, how they connect with the sidewalk. And what we're really doing there is trying to have a more form-based zoning, so not just saying what's allowed, but saying what the buildings have to look like so that they relate appropriately to the street and you create that real Main Street sort of feel. So some specific stuff is that blink walls and parking lots or parking decks are prohibited adjacent to primary street, except if you have parallel parking or on-street parking. And in certain locations, which is what is shown with a blue line on the map that you have, buildings would have to build storefront retail. The idea there was that those are really the key public streets, the places where we would really want retail. So the buildings have to be built for that. They don't have to put retail in right away. It could be an office space or something else in the short term, but it has to be built so that it could become a restaurant or a shop in the long term. Residential uses, and again, you can see more detail on all the uses on the use table, but single-family houses, detached houses would not be allowed anywhere in the Dunwoody Village. The idea there is just that there's not enough density with the single-family houses to create a real neighborhood feel and that walkability. Townhouses would be allowed in DV1 and DV3. Multi-unit housing would be allowed in all districts, so condos, lofts, that sort of thing, but apartments would require a special land use permit, which has to go through the process of going through City Council for approval. Senior housing would be allowed in DV1, 3, and 4, also with a special land use permit. And
What
then
does a special land use permit mean? What does that mean?
a special land use permit is something that says this is allowed only if the city grants special permission, so they have to apply for that. It's like applying for a rezoning.
Right.
There would be a public hearing where, property owners, neighbors could come and weigh in on that, and the city could approve it, deny it, or approve it with certain conditions.
Okay, thank you.
So regardless of the type of residential, the maximum density for anything would be 12 units per acre. We decided that was appropriate because we didn't want super high density here, but also that's a good number that does give you enough density to support the retail and restaurants. So in terms of commercial uses, generally what's allowed today would continue to be allowed, but a few things that we're changing based on what we heard. There's a lot of banks, I think everyone knows, in the village.
It is the village of banks.
So
That's what
all
it is.
of the existing banks and any other uses that are there today would be grandfathered in. We're not kicking anyone out. But if a new bank came in, they would have to be at least a quarter mile from another bank. So practically speaking, it would be really hard. Gas stations, car repair, and drive-thrus would not be allowed anywhere. Again, the idea is that it's a more walkable pedestrian kind of place, and those wouldn't be appropriate. And a number of uses are limited to 50,000 square feet. That's just trying to prohibit big box stores, so you couldn't get a giant, a Home Depot or a Walmart or something like that. Again, just trying to make sure that things are the right scale. So a lot that I've brushed over, but a lot more detail on the use table on the board. In terms of architectural standards, about a year ago, the city actually changed the zoning to not require the colonial Williamsburg style anymore. So that has already been changed, and that's not something we're proposing to bring back. But we do have basic standards to make sure that there's quality buildings, even if we're not regulating the style. So you'll see that facades have to be brick or stone or other materials. If you have glass storefronts, they have to be transparent so that they're not overly tinted so that you can see into the stores. And if you have parking deck entries, they have to be on the side streets. Parking decks have to have a building between them and the street so that you're not walking by a parking deck, but you're walking by a building that has a nice appearance. Building height varies based on the district. So DV4, Village Center, is the highest at 5 stories because that's really the core of the village where we want to have the most density, and that's not in anybody's backyard. But you'll see the others are 3 or 4 stories. And for DV1, where it's within 100 feet of single-family zoning, it would be limited to 3 stories. That's in addition to buffers, which I'll mention in a second, that you have to have next to single-family housing. So we think this does a pretty good job of creating that village, but also protecting the existing residential neighborhoods. In terms of open space, any redevelopment would be required to leave between 5 and 15% of that development as open space, which will be great because over time, incrementally, that provides you with green space, public spaces, all kinds of space here in the village. We wanted to make sure that wasn't just a leftover buffer or a parking lot island, which counts as open space in some cities' zoning ordinances. So we're requiring that to be a plaza, a green, a commons, or a park. And you can see the standards for that on one of the boards that basically says it has to be high quality design, has to be designed like this, and designed for people to be in it. It can't just be an empty space. We've also identified the 4 yellow areas on this map as potential public parking areas or parking decks. Those are the areas that are shown as slashes on your handout. And the goal here was to create parking decks that could be shared for all of the buildings that might happen around there, maybe shared by different uses, different developments. So you could park once and walk to all the destinations around there. This is something, again, that the city could maybe partner with and a developer as an incentive that would encourage them to redevelop. And again, these would have to either have buildings in front of them, be high architectural quality, so you're not getting a standard looking parking deck. Transitions, I mentioned this earlier, this is something that is outside the Dunwoody Village zoning district because the city has requirements citywide for buffers, so we would have to update that part of the code, but we would require buffers of 30 feet adjacent to existing single-family homes. So as redevelopment happens, it would have to leave at least 30 feet of buffer, and that buffer has to be pretty heavily landscaped and planted so that it's a real buffer. Within the village, there wouldn't be any buffers required. So if someone was putting in an office development next to a townhouse development, they wouldn't have to provide the buffers between, again, with the idea that this is more of a downtown, it's appropriate for things to be in close proximity and mixed use.